to record this session.
All right.
I'm getting a little better. Anyway, the Cornell had suggested an excellent topic, which is how do we design games when we think in process-intensive terms? And it's funny, it's something that's so innate to me that it never occurred to me to discuss this. So I'm going to start off by talking about the wrong way, the way people normally design games. The simplest way is to make variations in the data itself used in the game. That is, in the constants, I'm sorry, the bigger guns, bigger monsters. I'm going to take yesterday's game and I'm going to give it bigger guns and even bigger monsters. This is far and away the most common way people try to design games. Then the next step up is to actually alter some of the variables used in the game. And so we're going to have, or to even introduce a few new variables. So, you know, the way the health or armor of the player, stuff like that. A third method used in probably one of the most advanced methods in game design is to recombine elements from different games. This is how we got real-time strategy games. It used to be real-time games were all fast-paced, they were called hand-eye coordination games. And then we had strategy games, which went on a turn-by-turn basis, and we're slow and very thoughtful. And so then people came up with the idea, well, let's put these two together. And we came up with real-time strategy games, hooray. And in fact, an awful lot of these ideas just get recombined over and over and over again, which is one reason why I tend to be very unimpressed with most game designs, because I look at them and say, oh yeah, this uses a piece from the 1988 game, blah, 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 as well as the combat section from the 1996 game, blah, 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 and so forth. There aren't that many new games. Now, this may be new to the designer, but in terms of genuinely new ideas, there aren't that many. Although I will say that in the indie scene, we have in fact seen some interesting, innovative new ideas. So those are the wrong ways. Those are the ways that we've been stuck with for decades now and just can't seem to break out of. And so I'm going to talk about designing games from a more process-intensive approach. That is specifically to think in terms of, to start off by thinking about processes, which is the way I've always done it. That is, I'll look and say, gee, here's an interesting process. I wonder if I could make a game out of that. Well, for example, I'll start off with some of the simpler ideas. One thing would be to do something around what I'll call weird physics. Now, physics is all processes, and certainly we see lots of physics showing up in games where they have bullet trajectories and explosions and so forth. But the fun comes when you get into weird physics. For example, what would it be like to pilot a rocket ship around a three-body system? Most of the time we talk about, you know, here's a star or a planet and you're orbiting around it and you're going to run around and shoot things. Well, what if there were two things orbiting each other and you're sort of squeezing around between them? What if there were three things all in this complicated orbit? By the way, the three-body problem has never been completely solved. That is, there is no standard way using pure mathematics to calculate the motions of three bodies in orbit around each other. And it has to be done computationally. So anyway, you could have all sorts of weird stuff going on with orbits of that nature. Another thing would be to have an orbital motion. I mean, you could have halo, only instead of running around on the ground, you're flying around in space and you got these weird gravitational fields. Even more fun would be to vary the value of the exponent in gravity. Right now it's, you know, a 1/r² force. Well, what if it were 1/r³ or 1/r? 1/r to the 1.5 power. You can get into all sorts of really weird stuff here. And it would make for, I don't know, I think it might be interesting. Another thing, even weirder, would be to have a game in which the speed of light is comparable to human scales. In other words, what if the speed of light were 100 meters per second? Boy, then you'd have all sorts of crazy stuff going on, because as you started running, you'd start gaining weight and things would slow down for you and you'd sort of flatten out a little. Boy, you could do all sorts of, you could build all sorts of crazy games around low values of the speed of light. Another one, this would be very difficult. You'd need to really understand the physics well, but do one in which the Heisenberg constant is immensely larger. It's 6.62 times 10 to the minus 34 joules seconds, I think. What if it were much larger? That's what governs quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle. It's sort of a measure of how big quantum mechanics is. And so when you look at an electron, it's actually kind of a fuzzy thing that's sort of spread out. Well, what if you made the value of the Heisenberg constant so large that, you know, a cat was, you know, fuzzy. You didn't really know exactly where it was at any given time, and it might sort of bounce around, appear to bounce around. Then you'd have a really good question. Why did the chicken cross the road? Well, actually, it didn't really cross the road. It was on one side of the road, and then a little later you observed it to be on the other side. That doesn't mean it actually moved from one side to the other. I used this when I was an undergraduate, in my quantum mechanics course. The professor thought he'd be clever, and he on the final exam, he said, come up with a good question about quantum mechanics and answer it. And I leaned back in my chair and thought, oh, geez, come on. So I wrote, why did the chicken cross the road? And then I explained that in quantum mechanics, it didn't actually cross the road. So anyway, there are all sorts of wild and crazy things you can do with large values of the Heisenberg constant. Of course, all of that requires, you know, physics, and, you know, although the players don't really need to know the physics, you would need to know it. I'll tell you, the actual equations really aren't that nasty. They're pretty simple stuff. The Lorentz transform is the most complicated function you'll have to use, and that's, you know, square root of 1 over something over c squared, blah blah blah. So so that's one broad set of processes that can be used. You can also use traditional physics in simulation. For example, the basic equations for heat flow end up showing up in all sorts of places. I mean, 40 years ago, I did a game about heat flow, which was really about a nuclear power plant, and how heat flows around inside that. And it was an interesting game. But you can use heat flow for all sorts of other things, in economics, actually. Let's see, how do I want to? I'm now going to shift to a different way of thinking about processes, in particular, 3 special kinds of processes or relationships that can be of utility. One is what is called Galilean relativity. That's actually, I'll explain. Galileo realized that the speed of light, that light was not infinitely fast, that it might take some time to travel. And so he came up with an experiment, and he got one guy on a mountain with a lantern, and he was on another mountain with another lantern. And basically he had a game where he said, all right, cover up your lantern and then uncover it. And as soon as I see it, I'll uncover mine. And as soon as you see mine, you close yours. And as soon as I see you closing it, I'll close mine. And, this signal would bounce back and forth. And the frequency we got would be a measure of how fast the light travels. Well, light travels so fast that the frequency was really based on how fast they could move, which wasn't very fast. And so he realized, no, light is much, much faster than anything we can measure. But the concept of very slow information travel is interesting and can provide the basis for some interesting games. For example, in 1984, I designed a game called Last of the Incas. It was based on the Spanish conquest of Peru. And in it, what was interesting about Peru was it was so mountainous that travel was extremely slow. Basically, there were no roads. There were just paths, walkways, basically, through the mountains. And so the fastest information could travel was as fast as a person could walk, really. And so there was some resistance to the Spanish. That is, there were various revolts. And the problem is that the Spanish would be over here and there would be a revolt over there, and the Spanish wouldn't even find out about it until maybe a week later. And then if they started moving towards there, by the time they got there, the army that had revolted could have gone someplace else. And so it was actually a combination of 2 factors. One, point-to-point movement. That is, it wasn't just a grid and you could take any path you wanted. Highly restricted set of pathways. And by the way, that in itself is an interesting basis for a mechanic. That is, imagine a map with just a few little roads between connecting various points. That in itself is intrinsically interesting. In fact, I will digress for a moment to talk about that. One of the greatest military campaigns in history was done by a guy I call Freddie the G, more normally known as Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, around 1750 or so. And he got in a war. He decided to, Prussia at that time was basically Berlin and the immediate surroundings of Brandenburg. And he decided he was going to invade and annex Silesia, a province to the southeast of Berlin, which had all sorts of great mines and minerals in it. And so he invaded, and it was owned by Austria-Hungary, and the Austrians counterattacked. And what happened next was just a brilliant strategic campaign by Frederick. Basically, imagine these two armies, and they're moving around through this thin network of roads. And what happened was Frederick would, carefully move over here, and the other guy, looking at the roads, would decide, okay, well, the best thing to do is to move to there. And then Frederick would respond by moving in a direction that this guy didn't anticipate. And so he'd move over here, and this guy would realize, oh, gee, the only way out of this is to go backwards like that. And then Frederick would shift out here, and this guy would say, well, I'll go that way. And basically, Frederick kept moving in unanticipated ways. And the end result of his carefully planned moves was that he cut off the enemy army from its supply lines. And in those days, supply lines were absolutely crucial to the survival. I mean, basically, your men could starve to death unless they were getting, there were these wagon trains full of food that just kept coming to the army. And basically, Frederick cut off the wagon trains. And within a matter of days, the Austrian army was facing starvation, and the Austrian general surrendered. He had no choice. So that in itself is a very interesting mechanic that you can use for games, although it's most useful for war games. The Inca game I did had that sparse network, but it had the additional problem that your information about what the other guy was doing was always delayed by a considerable amount of time. And so your anticipation was not just spatial, but temporal. That is, you had to guess where he might be now. And I actually got the game running, but never published it. So Galilean Relativity is an interesting possibility. Basically, a game of any sort in which the information you have is late. Another broad mechanic, which I have been urging people to use for decades, and nobody seems to use it. Well, I shouldn't say that. I've seen it used a few times. And that non-commutative combat relationships. Rock, scissors, paper. That is almost all games nowadays where you have a conflict and the conflict is going to be resolved. The bigger gun defeat, or the bigger teeth, or the bigger sword, or whatever, defeats the smaller one. Oop-de-doo, that's boring. Much more interesting is the rock, scissors, paper approach, where basically if you have the rock and he plays paper, you win. But if you have the rock and he plays scissors, you lose. Now, the thing is, most people stop at that point and say, well, it's arbitrary because you have no idea what the other guy might play. Well, yeah, that makes it pure guesswork. But what if we rigged it so that you could have an idea of what he most likely will play? That is, what if there are mechanical factors that would induce somebody to play more or less of something? And for example, what if you had, each guy had a bunch of rocks, a bunch of scissors, and a bunch of papers? Well, that by itself might sound arbitrary, but what if another guy has 10 rocks, 4 papers and 6 scissors. Well, he'll probably play a rock, won't he? But what if you have only 3 papers and a bunch of scissors? Well, you have plenty of scissors to use, but you'll lose if you use your scissors against his rocks. But you only have a few papers, and do you really want to risk those? I mean, if he plays scissors and you do one of your papers, now you're down to 2 papers. You can get into all sorts of complicated situations here. This is what I used with C-Boot way back in 1986, where basically you had rock, scissors, and paper, but you could find out a little bit about what the other guy had. And much of the game was involved. You had a little bit of information. You started each turn with some information about what other people had. And then you'd go to people and say, tell you what, I'll tell you how many rocks Joe has if you'll tell me how many papers Mary has. And so you'd do these information switches, and boy, that made it really complicated. Especially when the other guy could lie. Yeah. So actually, I didn't have lying in the very first version, but that would make it even wilder. So, and yet it is not at all arbitrary. Now, the trick in C-Boot was that your judgments on these things depended on how much you liked and trusted other people. And those relationships developed as you played the game. So that's there, but there are a million ways to do that. Boy, mid-'80s, Bruderbund, a game called, it was Japanese, I think, Ancient Art of War, that's right. He had a very simple system where you had infantry, cavalry, and artillery, which is rock, scissors, paper. And you could send infantry or cavalry, and you'd fight a little battle and one side would win. Another possibility is to mix them. So you have, instead of sending 1 against 1, you could send a bunch. I'm going to send 3 rocks, a paper, and 2 scissors against his combination, and then they fight somehow. You can do it individually or on a group basis, and you have results of partial victory or defeat. Again, there are so many different variations you can use with non-commutative combat relationships, and it doesn't have to be combat per se. It can be any form of conflict. But I have not seen this mechanism used to anywhere near. It has not been explored in design anywhere near its potential. Then we can get even more theoretical with this. The trick with the non-commutative relationships is the concept of anticipation. And that's what makes games immensely more interesting. That is, when you're trying to figure out what the other guy might do. In fact, that was the appeal of my most successful game, Balance of Power, in which you, at the crucial time, you had to anticipate what the Soviet Union would do. And it wasn't arbitrary. There were clearly rules or forces that would induce the Soviets to do one thing or another. And you had to learn those. And once you learn them, you could get pretty good at anticipating their behavior. But the whole idea of anticipation is what made that that game so powerful. And again, I don't see a great deal of anticipation being utilized in game design. That is, the player really should have to spend a certain amount of effort trying to figure out what the other guy might do. And that is the non-commutative relationships is the simplest way to do that. But again, there are lots and lots of other possibilities here. Now, in a lot of first-person shooters, there is the anticipation element of, gee, will he duck behind that obstacle, or will he come straight across, or will he go to the left or the right, or that kind of thing. But we can do much, much better than that. However, anticipation, when we think in those terms, we're working at a very theoretical, very abstract level, and really you have to boil that down to a mechanic, something that actually involves making the decisions and factors that make a decision probable rather than certain. So, and also where it gets really fun is cross anticipation. I think that he'll do this, but he thinks that I'll do that, and therefore I'm going to do this instead. That goes on infinitely. And the way you get out of that infinite, I see rock, scissors, paper it has infinite recursion. You just keep guessing what the other guy might do. But as soon as you introduce a mechanical aspect to it, some sort of system of rules that constrain or induce activity, that you don't have to go very many levels deep. You can, one level is usually sufficient. Okay, let me pause now and take some questions before I move on to the next major chunk here. What do you guys think?
I wanted to ask you about some examples that I don't think you quite mentioned, but I've seen multiple games using these two mechanics. The first is a lot of games use different sorts of portals. And of course, the Portal series, Portal 1 and 2, actually they incorporate that into physics. It's not just go through here, come out here. You actually jump and you can go through the portal and you maintain your speed. And so it's that kind of spatial manipulation game that you were talking about earlier. And I thought that was really clever. Another mechanic is there's a game called Psychonauts. I've seen it in a few other places, but it's a gravity manipulation thing. So Psychonauts is a 3D platformer, but there's one particular level where all the levels are like dreamscapes inside the minds of different characters. And one of the characters is just so crazy that his mental world is all twisted over on itself like a pretzel. And so as you're traveling through, the gravity will shift so that which direction is down depends on where you are in the level. And it makes it a really fun and unique challenge.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
That's an example of playing with the physics.
Yes, exactly.
Let's see. By the way, you could do all sorts of cool things with general relativity, where you have light bending around things. And so what you see over here is actually over there, stuff like that. Other questions?
Yes, I'm not sure if you are planning to talk about it later. If so, please just let me know. But you started from the point of, I want to design a game, and like this is how I can make it more process based. But what if we catch ourselves as designers mid-production, mid-working on in the midst of working on the game, and the game is like very object-based, and we would like to introduce a bit of process-based elements to it. Or in other example, what if we, for example, aren't allowed to create a process-heavy game because it's a commercial project and someone decided that we should make more a classical game, and we still would like to experiment with it, or just introduce those concepts to players so that in the future there will be like more demand for it. So how can I take an existing design or something that we are, like, for example, currently working on, and move it in more in the process-based direction?
Oh boy, those are very real practical problems, but they are also fundamentally handicapped by the constraints you describe. For example, if you've already started off making a game in a conventional way, and then halfway in you say, I'd like to put more process stuff into it, I would say, no, that just can't be done, because the process aspect of the design must happen in the very, very early stages. It's the very first thing you worry about. That is, you don't start off saying, I'm going to do a game about baking cakes, and then halfway through say, now how do I get some process into it? No, you start off by saying, I'm going to do a game based on this kind of process. That is, it's the very first thing you do. And so trying to put it in later is, well, in a cake analogy, would be like trying to change a chocolate cake to a vanilla cake halfway through. And, I'm sorry, you've already committed yourself.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, that makes total sense. But okay, so let's take a simpler example. Let's say that, for example, we got some funding for. You started with an example of a shooter game with dudes in armors and guns. So let's say that someone who is providing the funding said, okay, we will do a shooter game because there is market for shooters. And we as designers want to push the boundaries further, make the game more interesting. And for example, in our case, we want to make it more process-based. So we can design the game pretty much anywhere, any way we'd like, of course, still maintaining the shooter aspect. So how can we take a pre-existing design, or at least a genre, and before starting to develop it, try to push it in the process-based direction?
Okay, so really the thing is, how can we do little process stuff, incremental process improvements on existing designs?
Perhaps not like little processes, but perhaps like part of the game is based on the process.
Well, one way to do it is with a sub game. That is, this is a common thing where you have your main game going along one way, but then every now and then you if you want to get more ammo, you got to go and barter with somebody to buy some ammo or something like that. Sub games have been used to experiment with odd play mechanics, and their track record is mixed. Many of them just don't work, but occasionally there have been some that have proved interesting. I'm not very optimistic about that approach. I understand that the commercial reality here, basically you're fighting against a fundamental problem, which I call everybody's a game designer. That is, everybody wants to try to tell the game designer how to design the game. They don't really acknowledge the reality that game design is a profession, and it takes years and years to become a good game designer. And an awful lot of people try to stick their noses into the design process and try to tell you how to do that. Now, one of the reasons for my success is that I'm enough of an asshole to tell people to get their fucking noses out of my work. And I got away with it. If you try that, you might just end up without a job. So it's an impossible situation. Maybe you can sweet talk them. I don't know, but at some point, either internally or externally, you've got to assert yourself as a game designer and say, look, who's going to design this game? Him or me? Oh boy, this is one of the things that has held back game designs so much, especially when you're talking about big, expensive games. The fundamental rule here is the more a game costs, the less innovative it will be. That's been a truism since the 90s. We had a lot more experimentation in the 80s when there wasn't that much money involved. People could afford to go off on experimental trips and try interesting things. But once the money started pouring in, so I would say really your problem is that you are caught in a fundamental trap from which there really isn't much of an escape. You can try to fool them. I've seen a lot of different ways out of it. And again, I will just tell you, there is no easy solution at all. I'm going to go ahead. Go ahead.
I understand. Sorry, please go ahead.
Well, I'd like to move on now because I've got another major portion here. And that is social behavior. That is, for the most part, games have concentrated on very simple physical types of problems, which tend to be not so much a matter of process. That is, the processes involved are very simple, very straightforward. And so most of the design work is really for the data of the game, what the images look like, the guns, their performance, and so forth, what the maze or the levels look like. But social behavior tends to have lots of processes involved. In fact, part of the problem is that social behavior is immensely complex in terms of the processes at work. But if you can extract or somehow narrow down the range of behavior, you can come to a kind of a form of social process that is computable. And one of the earliest of these was something I did way back in '83 called Gossip. And I then redid it about 8 years ago. And the version I came up with 8 years ago was very nice. I will send you here. Let's see if I can do this. There, I am sending a JPEG that shows the screen of this, although it's only partial. This is this was designed to be small enough to fit on a smartphone screen. And the initial design actually holds 6 characters. This is the simplest version with only 4 characters, but the 6 characters are laid out in a hexagon. And the idea is you can have arrows between any pair of characters and that will clearly indicate the nature of their relationship. The personality model is simple. There's just a single personality trait, which is affinity or affection, or how much they like or dislike somebody, and you represent those in colors. And basically all people do is make statements of affinity. This is the simplest form of social relationships game that is possible. And it can be certainly improved. I would love it if somebody would just steal this idea and publish it. I tried to publish it, and well, I don't do any marketing, and without marketing, you don't get anywhere. But the basic concept is very sound, works very well. The Atari version that I did back in '83 was really cute. It was done with supposedly telephones. And so you just use your joystick and you'd point to somebody you want to call, and you'd push the button and their telephone would go ring, 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 ring. And then they'd pick it up. And this was a huge technological leap forward. When they pick up the phone, they would say, hello? And that was really cutting edge technology back then. And then you would point at another person and use your joystick to make faces that were either, silent, varying degrees of that to express your feelings for it. It was a very clean, nice design. And in fact, that design could be used today pretty much as is. So anyway, the basic gossip design, what I call the statement of affinity game, is simple, straightforward. There are lots of interesting little variations you can do on it. And I highly recommend that as at least an exercise in design. Here, I'll hold it up so that our viewers, this is unfortunately a color inverted version because I didn't want to print a full page of black. But anyway, you point at different characters and click on them, and they can talk and you talk and blah, blah, blah. So statement of affinity is one of the simplest social behavior designs. By the way, there is another mechanic here that is very interesting, and that is the idea of relational variations in affinities. That is, what if you have 3 characters here, Joe, Mary, and Tom, and Tom and Mary start getting closer and closer. They like each other. Unfortunately, Tom hates Joe. And so as Mary gets closer to Tom, she's going to be pushed away from Joe because Tom hates him. So actually it would be like this. Tom, Mary, Joe, and Tom is like this. So if Mary likes Tom and she approaches him, she's automatically moving away from Joe. And how do you express this? With a spring algorithm. This sounds horrific at first, but it's actually fairly straightforward. Basically, you imagine springs connecting every pair of characters, and each spring has a natural length representing the affinity of one character for the other. This, by the way, assumes, though, that affinities are symmetric. If I hate you, you have to hate me. And that's where the spring algorithm doesn't work, because they don't have to be symmetric. but then you just minimize the total energy of the system. If the string is stretched a lot, then there's a lot of energy in that, and you just go through a minimization loop that comes down to the minimum total energy for the system. Let's see. Another huge area that has never been properly explored is information flow through groups. The way information flows through social groups is of enormous importance. The significance of that is, well, the quick way to summarize it is, no, I am your father. Luke says, ah! That's an example of how important information flow can be. Let's see, but you can build all sorts of interesting games around that. An obvious one is a spy game. You've got a mole in your spy agency. Somebody is leaking secrets. So how do you find out? So you're talking to this person and he says this, but maybe he's lying. And then you get more information and you can confirm some things. And then you find out, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. And you can presumably use that to zero in on the mole. Corporate politics, boy, that's an area I have never seen a game done on that. I have attempted several, and I must confess they are difficult. But information flow through a corporation can be crucial to the success or failure of an individual. And who do you know? Who do you trust? Who's your mentor? Is he going to tell you the information you need or want? You got a friend over in accounting. Maybe she'll give you some interesting information that will help you realize what's really going on. Information flow through a group is based on factors such as frequency of meeting. How often do you run into that person? Freedom of information flow. That is, do you bump into them over the water cooler and say, hey, how you doing? Gee, what do you think of them Yankees? What's been going on in your department lately? Or do you only encounter them in meetings in front of the president of the corporation? Trust is another very important factor in information flow. Another important factor is the significance of each piece of information. That is, some information will flow quickly through a group because it's important. Other information flows more slowly. I developed an entire system for the earlier version for Erasmataz for dealing with information flow through the system. And I carried some of it over into Storytron. What I found was that it was just too complicated for most people to handle. But information flow is a very significant process, and you can build an entire game just around information flow. Another area that has been overdone is military processes, logistics, mobility, flanking, all of that stuff. That's been very, very thoroughly handled. There are a zillion strategy war games that take these factors into account. And as far as I'm concerned, that field is pretty much boring now. However, it is possible to learn some things by experimenting along those lines. Try doing a strategy war game with divisions moving around on a map and logistics and that stuff. It can be useful as an educational process, but that's about all. Economics. Ooh, this can get messy. However, mercantile processes, there are some very interesting mercantile processes. For example, I think a very interesting game could be done about the mercantile processes involved in Venice and the Islamic world around just before the Renaissance, where they had this merchants in Venice would go to, typically they'd go to Egypt and Cairo, and they'd trade for stuff there, most of which was coming from India or China. And then they would take it to Venice, and then it would end up going over the Alps into Germany or France or whatever. And the way they carried out those processes was intrinsically interesting. If you want to know more about by the way, you really should be reading everything, because oftentimes a book will provide me with ideas for an interesting process. Here's an interesting book by a French author. It's about 30 years old now, and even older. And it describes in detail how merchants did their thing at various times. And the processes involved in making all of this work were really complicated. One big trip was one big problem, which led to I can't remember the technical term. Here you are, a merchant, you go to a fair in France to sell stuff. Do you really want to go home carrying a few pounds of gold coins? No, 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 no. You get a bill of, I forget what it was called. You get a piece of paper, which is basically a check, but they didn't have anything like that then. But the piece of paper said, was in effect a letter. Hey, Joe Banker in Milan, you're my banker and I have an account with you, and I want you to give this guy here, Fred Jones, I want you to give him 50 pieces of gold, okay? And you carried that. That way, if the robbers stopped you and tried to steal from you, they don't care. Piece of paper is worthless to them. So that was how they dealt with the problem of highway robbery. So the processes involved in making these things work. Great game could be built around the Silk Road, by which China traded with the Mediterranean civilizations, and basically China sent silk and the Mediterranean civilizations sent silver back. So let's see, Ajmal has something. As medium centered on systems, how do you think the stories, interactive storytelling games tell might be different to stories in other mediums? One idea is that the stories that emerge through interaction might be able to meaningfully portray complex human systems better than in linear stories. You know, you mentioned political, environmental, and economic simulations. I think that wrapping systems like these around the core of social simulation could be very effective if done right. Yes. Oh, damn it, we're out of time. I'm going to dodge that question because next month I will be talking more about interactive storytelling. So let me quickly finish. God, I talk too much. Political simulations are very worthwhile. The only ones that I've seen attempted have been election simulations, which are really stupid. How do you get elected to be, president? And they just give you these little choices on what campaign positions you're going to take. And you have to look up the polls. So basically you're just saying, oh, the people want more hot dogs. Okay, I will provide lots more hot dogs to everybody. Really stupid stuff. Political stuff involves, real politics involves lots of interesting negotiations, Unfortunately, they do get into some complexities because those negotiations are ultimately driven by mechanical factors that are typically outside the range of the game. So in other words, I want to pass this bill and you will, and I'm trying to get your vote, and you'll vote for me if I support the expansion of a military base in your district. Now we got to bring military bases into the game, and that guy wants, you know, all abortions to be declared illegal, and you know, now you got to bring that into it, and it's very difficult to keep it tightly constrained. Geopolitical, it's sad. The geopolitical balance of power game was an enormous success. Now, part of that was the context of the times, but a geopolitical game about the US relationship with China would be excellent, I think, very timely. I've seen only a few geopolitical games, and they're really stupid. If you're going to do a geopolitical game about the conflict between America and China, you really have to understand what's going on both sides. And you're going to have to do a lot of reading. For all of my games, I do a lot of reading before I set to work designing it. And you got to understand the processes if you're going to put them into the game. And that's something a lot of people are too lazy to do. But we're right now at a very interesting point where we're starting to build into a conflict. And if we manage this wrong, it's going to get to be a very ugly conflict that will hurt both sides very badly. But we could also turn it down. You know, we could easily, it's an inflection point. Things really could go either way right now. And that makes for a very interesting game. But in order to do that, you're going to have to understand a lot of processes going on, especially, you know, you can, since all of us, Savian here, are Westerners, and we understand Western politics, but very few Westerners have any comprehension of the Chinese politics. It's very different from what we do, and yet it's what drives their geopolitical, their diplomatic stances. And you got to understand that if you're going to model it properly to show what would really happen. My fear is that somebody will come out with a geopolitical game where China is just another Western country that acts and thinks just like a Western country, and that won't be interesting at all. Okay, let's just have some last questions here. Let me catch up on, there's a game called Democracy that perhaps fits. Cornel, can you describe that game for us?
Yeah, it's basically, it's a series of games currently. And you're like a politician who wants to pretty much stay in power, or at least your political faction to stay in power. And you have to make a lot of different decisions, and it dodges most of the problems you mentioned about by being quite abstract. Like there is no environment to speak of. It's mostly like UI. But it's like, it's pretty good, at least in the terms of that type of games or that type of genre.
Certainly a political game based on parliamentary democracy, I think, is more manageable than the American system. The American system is so screwed up that trying to do a game around the American system is just an exercise in frustration. Whereas the parliamentary democracies that we have in Western Europe are much more computationally reasonable. And so if I were going to do a game about democracy in general, I would build one around parliamentary democracy. And maybe in America, this could be a useful way to educate American citizens to understand that how screwed up our system is. One nice thing here I will point out is that there's an awful lot of money for educational games in politics. Unfortunately, a lot of that, the people with the money probably would not respect you as a designer enough to let you do it properly. I could do that. I could go and say, you're going to do it my way because I'm the greatest game designer, blah, blah, blah. But you guys would face a more difficult problem dealing with that kind of money. Chris, I have a political section in my interactive story set in the French Revolution. Good time period, very interesting processes, which should be coming out this year, which involves deciding which faction, which factions to back, balancing the desires of certain factions to create the government with the policies you want. And I presume, Chris, that you have this wonderful point where, they make a decision and the next screen just shows a guillotine, chop, and nope, you made the wrong decision.
Yeah, that's one potential end. Yep.
So, yeah, French Revolution is also very interesting. Roman Civil War, any situation where it's very fluid, where the combinations of people and the factions are very fluid. That can make an interesting game. Your problem there is keeping it simple enough that it doesn't just completely confuse the player. That's the big problem you have there. But yeah, that's French Revolution is definitely good. Let's see. Any last questions here? I realize I feel like I really didn't give enough time to some of these topics. So if you want, you might I can next month expand on some of this stuff and we can have a little more discussion. Otherwise, I'll do something based on Le Mort d'Arthur, which I continue to work on. And it's up to you guys. So please send me an email or make a comment on either Thaddeus or Slack, and we'll take it from there. Anything else? Okay, we're done. I'll see you guys next month.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.